Hello, my name is Dave DePeters. I'm CEO of the National Repertoire Orchestra. It's my great pleasure to welcome you here to this NRO educational event. I'd especially like to welcome all of our 2020 NRO fellows who are not able to join us here in Breckenridge this summer, but we look forward to having you here for our 2021 season. We hope you stay safe and healthy and comfortable wherever you are. Today's seminar is provided by the NRO free of charge for all participants and visitors, and we want to thank our educational sponsors, Alpine Bank, Breckenridge Grand Vacations, Colorado Creative Industries, Pat and Steve Larson, the Summit Foundation, and the town of Breckenridge. They make these seminars and masterclasses possible. Today's seminar will be given by Joshua Weilerstein. Joshua Weilerstein is the artistic director of, and I'm not going to say the French version of it, the Chambre Orchestra of Lausanne. How about that?
That works.
I butcher it every time. He is an in-demand conductor throughout Europe and the United States. He is known for his clarity of musical expression, boundless enthusiasm, and a deep natural musicianship. His enthusiasm for a wide range of repertoire is combined with an ambition to bring new audiences into the concert hall. And on a personal note, I got to know Josh over the last few years with the New York Philharmonic, and I can certainly attest to his tremendous musicianship. And, when I was writing this, I was thinking about you, and I came up with this phrase that I really like, a relaxed command of the orchestra. And I want to talk about that as we get going on. And finally, I just want to mention Josh's podcast, Sticky Notes, which has been going on for God knows how long, for 3 to 6 years. And I recommend you all checking it out. First of all, I want to congratulate you. When you first started doing these things, when I just Googled Sticky Notes, it was like 3 pages of selling sticky notes before I got to your podcast. But you're on you made the front page now.
Made the front page now, yeah.
Well done, sir. So anyway, welcome, Joshua Weilerstein.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you. Thank you very much for being here and taking the time. I want to start off first. You are coming to us from London.
Yes.
So welcome back to the United States for this brief moment. Why live in London? How long have you been there? What's going on with your life?
So I've lived here for a little over 2 years. So at the time, a lot of my work was in Europe. I was the artistic director in Lausanne, and also my wife is Israeli. And so we decided that, with my work there and also the difficulty for her to see her family going from New York all the way to Tel Aviv, those are the sort of dual reasons we decided to make this move. So we joke that we made our families equally unhappy by being directly in the middle between where my parents live in Boston and where her parents live in Tel Aviv. So that was one of the main reasons. And also just for me to travel a bit less consistently during the year, to not have to make 30 transatlantic flights a year, which is what I was doing before we moved. That was something that was quite exhausting, also quite damaging to the environment, and we just didn't want to keep doing that. So we ended up settling on London because my wife is a social worker and wanted to work in English. Obviously that made it very easy to choose London.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. So you mentioned Sticky Notes. Why did you start Sticky Notes? What were you trying to accomplish with it, and did you think you'd be doing it this long?
No, I thought I would make 10 episodes and get a couple hundred people, mostly my friends and family, to listen to it. At the time, there were no classical music podcasts other than ones that symphony orchestras put out as sort of adjuncts to program notes. And so I thought, basically, my inspiration was, what would Leonard Bernstein be doing if he was still alive, to be kind of evangelizing classical music? Because he was such an amazing advocate for music to everyone. And so I thought he would probably have a podcast. And I just started putting it together based on pieces that I loved doing, colleagues that I'd worked with that I could interview, and also topics that I thought were kind of undercovered in the classical music world. So I made 10 episodes, put them out, and thought that would be it, and is just kept going for the last 3 years. And a couple months ago passed 1 million downloads, which is just totally mind-blowing. And so it's something that's now a huge part of my life, and I absolutely adore doing it every week.
Well, that's fantastic. And yes, and congratulations. Anyone that you want to get on sticky notes that you haven't been able to, or anyone who has said no?
I would really love to have Joyce DiDonato on the show. She hasn't had time. What's been absolutely like one silver lining of the pandemic has been that everybody's free. So I was able to have a couple of artists on that were previously unavailable, like Mahanis Fahani, the wonderful harpsichordist. So yeah, I'm still emailing people that I know are not working at the moment, and hopefully they'll have the time to come on for an hour and talk.
Hopefully you've got to get them in soon, because hopefully they'll all be back to work.
Right, exactly. And I mean, especially in Europe, where a lot of orchestras are going to be starting up by September, that definitely the goal is to get those interviews in now rather than later.
Well, I have one last sort of personal question for you, and I hope you don't mind, but I find this fascinating. Obviously, you come from a musical family. So having grown up in a musical family around musicians, I guess there's a lot of questions that I have, but I'm wondering, anything that you learned that was probably particularly learned because you came from a musical family, that helped you in your career path and has sort of taught you any mantra or anything that you've sort of understood from your parents, your sister, from from everybody that says, I got to do it this way, kind of a thing?
I would say three things. The first would be just a total love and commitment to music that all my parents and my sister all have in spades. That sort of commitment is something that I just learned by osmosis as a kid, waking up to my dad practicing in one room, my mom practicing in another, and my sister practicing in another. The second thing, something I learned from my dad, who is a wonderful violin teacher for those who don't know. I was doing a competition on the violin, and I did not win. And I was a little, obviously a little bit disappointed. And he said, you did your best, which is all you can do. And also just remember that it's not up to you who wins this competition. All you can do is do your best, and then it's up to other people. And they might have a whole different set of criteria to what you have. And when we start talking about auditions later, I think that's something that is really important. And then the third thing is a more practical thing, actually, which I'm very lucky about, which was that when I won this conducting competition, which basically started my career, I was suddenly circled by all of these managers. And a lot of people have had trouble with, getting started too fast and getting kind of thrown to the wolves. And having my family be so embedded in the music business, for lack of a better word, they were able to help me and advise me so much in what to do and how fast to go and how slow to go, more like. And that is something that I feel incredibly privileged to have been able to get from them.
That's great. That's great advice. Thank you. So you mentioned audition. Let's start right off with some questions.
Sure.
So for people who are listening, we had a lot of our musicians fellows this year. We asked them to send in questions, and my job will be to read some of them and see if we can create a nice conversation utilizing these questions. So about auditions, if you can just share any of your perspectives, I think this begins with just sort of a general understanding. What are your general perspectives on orchestral auditions?
I think it was Churchill who said that it's like democracy is the worst system of government except for all the others. I think a little bit like the system of auditions is that way. It's a terribly impersonal, terribly awkward, terribly focused on one specific moment in time, but I don't know a better way to do it. The one thing that I've slowly been convinced more and more of is actually that the famous screen, should stay up for the entire course of the audition, not only the earlier rounds. I've personally witnessed now too many times a player who has a certain quirk of posture, a certain quirk of playing that is visual, that did not show up in their playing at all when they were behind the screen suddenly torpedo their chance of getting into the orchestra. And I find that quite unfair. And so that's something that I have started to feel like advocating more for, is that aspect of it. But in general, you know, an audition it's this moment in time that, again, you can show up and do your best at, but it's up to a panel of musicians who, in a lot of cases, you've never met, you don't know what they're looking for. And so in a way, coming and just doing your personal best and playing in your own personal way is, I think, the best kind of advice that I can give.
That's great. Yeah, absolutely. So we have with us on the panel today, Mina Hong. And Mina's a violinist, and she's been with the NRO for the last couple of years, and she's in town right now actually performing with a string quartet. And so I'd like to ask Mina to join us. There she is.
Hi, Mina.
And Mina, you have a question for Josh?
Yeah, I have a few questions, actually. The first one is, what does the panel generally look for during the audition process, and if they prioritize certain aspects of the audition more than the others, and not just in general, but kind of, is it the same throughout each round of an audition?
I think I should emphasize that it's my personal experiences, and every panel and every orchestra is going to be a little bit different with that answer. For me, just to do the last part first, the first round for me is a chance to just hear if somebody is coming prepared. And if they have learned the excerpts. I've had a few experiences where a person comes in and plays an amazing first movement of a classical concerto, and it sort of blows everybody away. And then they play, you're a violinist, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in your case, like the last movement of Brahms 4, and they come in and clearly have never heard that symphony in their life. And, you know, the tempo's all wrong. There's stylistic things that are very strange. And that, for me, that eliminates that person right away, because what are they there for if not to play in an orchestra? And if you can't find the style of a 30-second excerpt, then it's going to be hard for you to play in the group full time. Sorry, remind me of your other two questions.
My other question was, I guess that kind of answers the first question, but I have a different question. Is there something in particular that you as a conductor might look for that kind of differs from other conductors?
So for anybody who's been on the other side of one of these screens, especially in early rounds, the people do tend to run together. Everybody's playing for 5 minutes, playing almost exactly the same things. And so for me, an audition is not only a chance to hear someone play all the notes correctly. It's also a chance to hear a spark of creativity. And I think that especially goes actually for wind and brass players, especially for solo positions, first positions, hearing someone's creative ideas, and not to just be a kind of blank slate for the conductor to influence. And yeah, so I think it's this tricky tightrope, and in a way, I think you should kind of learn what the orchestra's sound is of the orchestra you're auditioning for, if they have a specific thing that they're known for, or listen to a few recordings of the excerpts with their music director and the orchestra playing. But in the end, you do have to come and be yourself, because otherwise it won't be convincing. And when you're one of maybe 250 people coming, you have to convince people right away and get their attention.
Cool. And then my last question is, so by the end of all of the rounds, the final round, how much does somebody's personality or attitude affect the final decision of a winner for the set position? Does that,
Do you mean like personality in terms of their playing, or their whole?
Just like as a person, because I haven't gone to the final round of an audition yet, but I imagine you get to know the person a little bit, whether through conversation or just kind of just based on the way they communicate. So I'm wondering if that kind of affects who you decide, like if it's between two people.
It can. I mean, there's some conductors, I've done this a few times, where you ask somebody to change something a little bit just to see how they react. I especially do that with wind players. And, you know, based on the way they respond to that, if it's quick, then that, in my mind, bumps them up. If it takes a few times, it doesn't knock them down, but it's if they are trying, I think that's something that I appreciate. But it does kind of go to something else that I think auditions should have, which is an interview component. Again, not to be the sort of determining factor, but in an audition, you're not hiring a violin, you're hiring a person and a human being. So I think that the person's personality and how they come across to an audition panel is very important. And in my ideal world, there would be an interview where you could get to know somebody a little bit. But in that 30 seconds where somebody says to you, oh, could you just try this a little bit faster? You know, just trying, not worrying about it too much, but just trying and being enthusiastic. I think that's the best, again, the best you can do.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the question.
Thank you, Julia. Oh, I'm sorry, Mina. I'm saying hi to Julia, though. Julia will be joining us in a little bit.
Okay.
Sorry. So continuing on with some audition questions here. You did mention this because this was one of the questions is, do you think it's important for musicians to try to perform in the style of if an orchestra has a known style? So, you know, the difference between, you know, a Cleveland orchestra, a Philadelphia orchestra, a New York Philharmonic, you know, because you were involved with, you know, with a number, do you think that it's important to have that sort of style already in your playing?
I think you can have a framework of what that orchestra is known for. But again, you know, it's something that's talked about a lot, that orchestras 60 years ago sounded quite a bit more different than they do now. I think there is an element of homogeneity among orchestras now. But yeah, having a framework of knowing what an orchestra is known for helps. But again, I mean, in my opinion, though, you can't know what a panel of musicians is thinking. You know, you might have a person who's been in the orchestra for 30 years who hates the style of the orchestra and wants to have somebody different. You don't know, maybe. The conductor might have not had enough coffee that day and want all the tempos to be faster. You know, it's so, you know, again, I think if you're showing up being who you are, you have a better chance of catching someone's attention than if you're trying too hard to sort of tick all the boxes. Now, if there's a very specific thing that you know, if you're a wind player and you know the other person has a certain thing that they preferred here, fine. But I think in general, you can't try too hard to please everybody. A good life lesson too, I would say.
That's great. Do you think there's anything that comes to mind of a definite do not do in an audition?
Well, again, I mean, I mentioned it before, but to me, what's more important than your concerto is the way you play the excerpts. And if I can tell that the excerpt was the last thing on your mind, then I'm going to be significantly less interested in you as a player in the orchestra, I would say. So that it's more of a do this, but it just be as prepared as possible with the excerpts. Also, if not just for the reason that the conductor or another member of the panel might ask you to try something different. And if you're sort of locked into only one way of doing it, it can be hard to adjust.
Yeah, absolutely. That flexibility, building in flexibility into your playing is certainly a must. So, you know, as a violinist and then as a conductor, you've taken auditions, you've done competitions and things. Do you have any recommendations for how to mentally prepare?
I think, again, going back to you can only do your best and it's not up to you, is the best way that I can think of to mentally prepare for something. And also, in a way, I mean, it's hard because these auditions are so pressure filled, and you feel like your whole life is built up to this 5 minutes. Or, you know, if you move on, then in the next 5 minutes, and then the next 5 minutes, and then the final round or something like that. And a little bit of a reminder of what the stakes are is important, I think. Knowing that you're not doing surgery, you're not, you know, your life is not threatened by this audition. It sounds silly, but I think it does help to get that perspective sometimes. And also to just have faith and confidence in your own preparation. I think actually mental preparation and physical preparation go really hand in hand. If you feel I've spent the time with the music and I'm ready to go, then more often than not, I think you will do well in the audition. Will you win? Who knows? But at least you can personally say, I've done the best I can.
Like you said, that's what you have control of.
Yeah.
That's what you can do. And speaking of lack of control, I always forget 1 or 2 or 3 things that I'm supposed to announce at the beginning of these things, and leave it off until something clicks in my head. Usually Kristen yelling at me. But I just want to make sure everybody, anybody in the audience who's listening in, if you'd like to ask a question of Josh, please use the Q&A button and go ahead and write in any question you have. Okay, that's that. Now, we were going to ask Eduardo Rios, a violist here. He's actually in town, and he's going to be asking some questions also about auditions.
So I had a question. Mina did a great job of asking so many questions, and I feel a little bit, I find myself a little stuck in the question that I already had prepared. But I'm adjusting. I adjusted it in my head. One of the questions actually that I had was how appropriate is it to, because I mean the last audition I did, I advanced to the semifinals, and of course the pool becomes much smaller and way more intimate.
Yeah.
How appropriate is it to even speak, even if it's slightly, to the panel, to seem personable? I mean, I'm a big believer, of course, in what you were saying about the screen should stay up, and I really like that idea. But unfortunately, we're in a world right now where the screen comes down eventually, and you're in front of people. So how appropriate to you would it be to speak to the panel at all, if at all?
I think if you are asking a question, it's fine, or just to say hello, nice to be here. I personally would not have a problem with that at all. And I think something I actually learned as a conductor was all of the things that we panic about a little bit, like, oh, are my shoes tied? Did I say this thing exactly correctly to the musicians? All of them are wiped away the moment you start playing. And if, within 10 seconds, it's the same for conductors. A conductor gets on stage on the podium, and Dave can, I'm sure, attest to this. In, approximately 10 or 15 seconds, the orchestra knows how they feel about you. And it's very hard to change that. And I think in Dave's laugh, in an audition situation, it's somewhat similar. And if you say, hello, nice to be here, if a person asks you to do something and you want it to be clarified, as long as you're positive and with a good attitude, I don't think it can hurt you in the slightest, in my personal opinion. Okay,
well, that's good to hear. Actually, my other question was regarding comments. I always get very, very nervous about asking comments, either in person or through email. And I guess my question would be, like, how would you approach asking comments in a non, I don't want to seem overzealous in any way. So how would you say that a musician should approach asking for comments?
I think if you are unlucky enough to be knocked out very early when there's a huge pool of people, it's a little harder because they might not have a really specific thing, and then they might feel a little bit under pressure to remember violist number 76 out of 120 or something. But in the case of if you went, advanced quite far, I think it's fine to write an email asking, did you have any thoughts? And obviously, if you don't, it's fine. Just sort of leaving them the room to say, I don't really feel like it. I remember one violinist who auditioned for my orchestra. She made it to the final and did not get the position, and nobody got the position. We didn't take anybody. And she wrote to me and asked why she didn't get it. And I just gave her a few thoughts about a couple of the excerpts. And she came back and she won. And she had taken the advice that I gave her. And I know she also wrote to other people in the orchestra. And it was not the act of her writing, but actually that she came back and did all the things we mentioned to her. And we thought, okay, she's obviously going to be a good colleague, and she plays really well, and she made these changes, so let's take her. So that was a big part of that, actually.
Okay, well, that's all I had.
Okay.
Like I said, Mina covered every base when it comes to auditions very, very well. So But thank you so much for answering my questions.
Yeah, sure. Thanks.
Eduardo, next time we'll have you go first so you can take Mina's questions.
Yes, so I can have priority and not feel under pressure for changing my questions slightly.
That's right.
My palms are sweaty, but okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Eduardo. So Josh, to change things up just a little bit, let's talk a little bit about practicing and maybe even specifically toward, preparing for an audition. But do you have any techniques or any thoughts on the best way to be preparing for an audition through the practicing, not just mentally, physically?
I think I always, slow practice is the best practice in a way, and building things up, especially with excerpts where there is that sort of technical bar that you're trying to leap over. I think there is definitely a sense of you want to just build things up very slowly. I remember when I was auditioning and I was doing the Scherzo of Schumann's Second Symphony, which is this legendarily terrorizing excerpt for violinists, that I started with the metronome at like 92 to the quarter note, and I stayed there for a week, and then I went up slowly. And obviously sometimes you don't have time to do that, but in general, I think that kind of build up really helps you feel secure in an extraordinarily stressful situation. And then, sometimes I remember an audition where I was playing the Eroica Symphony Scherzo, and I played it about 4 times too fast because I got nervous. And the conductor, this was at school, the conductor said, "You want to try that again a little slower?" And I said, "Sure, no problem." And I did it, so again, like, to go back to Eduardo, your question a little bit, it can be a sort of give and take. And obviously, if you get nervous and make a mistake, you might be able to be asked to do something again. So yeah, in terms of the preparation, I think slow practice, and also getting actually with the screen thing, because we're so used to performing, we want that connection with other people. And maybe this is now easier post lockdowns, but practicing literally to a wall can help, because a screen is such an unnatural thing on a stage. And to literally maybe put the instrument close up to the wall and practice directly into that gives you a sound and also the sort of strangeness of that experience.
Yeah, I took an audition in an orchestra that will remain nameless, but the second round of it was moved from the concert hall to a classroom, to a school, and then ultimately in a classroom where they had the screen sort of dividing the classroom in half. And first of all, that feels a little bit weird to begin with, but what really freaked me out was when, you're playing percussion, it's pretty loud, right? And you sort of, now I'm in a classroom, so I've got to adjust a little bit, and you start thinking about those things. But when I saw somebody's foot go, out from underneath the screen, it was more of a drape, and I realized how close they were to the instruments. I mean, I was right on the other side of them. And for percussion, I mean, it's really hard to imagine, right? But right. You've got to sort of make your way through all of these things.
Absolutely. It's tricky. Yeah, there's no accounting for the circumstances, and in a way, practicing many different circumstances, I think, helps. One really silly thing I've done as a conductor, this is not about auditions as much as just sort of trying to practice your environment, because conductors never get a chance to practice with an orchestra. You're in it right away. And one of the things when I was starting out that I was struggling with was making eye contact and holding eye contact with musicians. And so I literally drew stick figures onto pieces of paper and put them around the room and practiced staring them down, and not staring them down, but looking at them and holding my gaze. And it actually really helped in real life too. And so, anything you can do, anything you can think of that might happen in an audition that you can practice helps you in that moment.
That's great. Yeah, that's right. You really never know what's going to happen, right?
Exactly.
But the thing is, the other thing to keep in mind is, unless it's a singular event in your audition, but for the most part, if it's raining, if something's, whatever's going on, it's going on for everybody.
Exactly.
Like everybody's experiencing the same acoustics, everybody's experiencing the same thing, and someone's going to react well
Mm-hmm.
And why not be you?
Yeah, absolutely. And you can think about how athletes train for all weathers, all circumstances, for their games, matches, and things like that. I think a musician preparing for an audition can think in that way as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about conducting. Do you find any composer particularly difficult to either interpret or to perform?
Well, there's some new music that's really hard to conduct. The John Adams Saxophone Concerto ruined my life for about a month because of the amount of
The Escapades?
No, it was a new one. He wrote for Tim McAllister, and it was just full of so many polyrhythms and things that it was just. And I ran into him actually in Paris of all places, and I said, "John, thanks for ruining my month with that concerto." And he was like, "Oh no, it's not that hard. Don't come on, don't exaggerate." And I said, "No, it really is that hard." But that's on a sort of technical level. In terms of musical things, I don't think necessarily of a composer, but of specific pieces. For example, I think Beethoven's Sixth Symphony is the hardest Beethoven symphony because it's so unbelievably simple and in a way that it exposes everything about you as a musician. And so many people try to do so many things with it and then it just falls flat. And so a piece like that, I think, is really, really hard. I'm looking over at my score shelf trying to think of other things. Specific movements of pieces, I think, like, for example, the last movement of Dvorak's 7 is really hard to keep the tempo moving, to keep the pacing going. I've always found that difficult. Of course, conducting Mozart is just, you feel like you do one thing in the wrong place and the whole thing falls apart. I do personally feel a little more comfortable with that kind of thing in 20th century music. The classical era stuff is so fragile in that sense. But, in the end, I am really in love with all music from the beginning to now. And there's a very short list of composers that I don't feel comfortable yet conducting.
Mm-hmm. Great. And do you feel like talk to us a little bit about how your violin playing informed your conducting and vice versa?
Yeah, I mean, it's the kind of thing I miss the other, when I'm playing the violin, I miss conducting. When I conduct, I miss playing the violin. Obviously, on a very practical level, there's more violins than any other instrument in the orchestra. And my knowledge of string playing helps me a lot. When I make a comment to a string player, I know the physicality. And actually, I think it's something that all conductors should learn, to play at least one instrument. Not, you don't have to obviously play at a professional level, but to learn the functioning of an instrument from each family. For string players, the way a string player uses the bow, that's, you can conduct that way. You can show a gesture in that way. And a wind and brass player or percussionist needs something different. I've started learning the clarinet over the last year. I can't play at all, but I do have now, I think, a deeper understanding of what a clarinetist or a wind player needs in terms of breath, in terms of articulation. And so I think for conductors, to try to get your hands on as many instruments as possible is really important.
Oh, that's really great. So this is actually my question. As you were talking, I thought of one for myself.
Sure.
When you have, whether it's a contemporary piece or, any era, romantic, classical, whatever, if you have a question about something, why did the composer choose this of all things, and that, whether it's an articulation, a note, a chord, something, where do you go to find your answers?
I am a voracious reader of composer biographies. I think you can learn a lot, not because they said in this phrase you should do this. Very few composers did that. But you can learn little nuggets about their personal life that I think make a huge difference. For example, my favorite composer biography is Jan Swafford's book on Brahms, which I recommend to everybody. It reads like a novel, and it's incredibly moving and tragic and sad, his whole relationship with Clara Schumann. And there was one passage that he discovered this letter that Brahms wrote about, and I'm sorry for any trombonists on this webinar, but that he said he doesn't like the instrument. He doesn't like trombones. And he only uses them when he wants to portray something quite dark and ominous. And he called it, I think, like black wings are in the air. And so there's a moment in the first movement of Brahms' Second Symphony where there's this kind of very strange trombone choir. And I always wondered, what was he trying to portray there? And then I found the answer in that book. So, you know, for me, like that's the primary sources are where you try to go. And then sometimes you just got to come up with the answer for yourself and hope that you are doing justice to the composer.
Right, right. You know, it's funny though, in that Brahms symphony, the end is, I would never describe that as, you know, black wings. I would never.
That's true. Yeah, they transform.
So triumphant and
absolutely.
One of the great moments in music is the end of the Second Symphony at the same time. You know,
absolutely,
because of his trombone writing.
Yeah, and I think you can make this. I think it's kind of, I'm inventing this, but you can see it as a kind of transformation. A lot of people wonder why that last movement is so cheerful right away. And it sort of is like the wings have gone away, and now it is now soaring easily and freely. And that last trombone chord you know, gives me chills thinking about it. So, you know, it's that kind of thing of the whole idea of the piece has been transformed from darkness to light.
Oh, that's great. So let's stay on programming for a little bit. Tell us a little bit about your philosophy for programming.
I think there's been a lot of conversations about this, and I think that what we can really try to do is modernize and expand our canon. There's so many wonderful pieces that we play all the time, and we should continue to do those pieces. But I think there are, especially with living composers now and also composers of the past, that can be sitting alongside these great composers. And I think that's a really important thing. I also think, you know, format of concerts, we don't always have to have overture, concerto, symphony. It's a 100-year-old concert format that works very well, but there are different ways of doing it. And so what I'm looking for also, whatever repertoire, it could be 3 completely standard pieces, it could be 3 complete pieces that no one's ever heard of, is a sort of journey and a sort of narrative throughout the concert. Whether that's in historical narrative, whether that's a harmonic narrative, whether that's just where composers that I think work well together musically. Like, for example, I think Beethoven and Shostakovich work really well together because they sort of are speaking about the same things, you know, humanism and triumph over, you know, destiny and all of that. I think Caroline Shaw and Haydn work really well together because there's something about the character of those 2 composers that I think really matches. So yeah, when I'm putting together a program, I'm trying to think of that journey from beginning to end and not just a set of disparate pieces that I like.
Do you find yourself though trying to, it's not so much themes, but you know, have you ever tried to get a point across, if you know what I mean? You know, like, this is something that's been bugging me for a while, and I'm going to say it in music, in this program, whatever that is.
I think you can do that. What I try to avoid doing is sort of telling the audience what I'm doing. And I would like them to get to the conclusion themselves. Because I think as soon as you give away your background for something, then it loses its salience a little bit. You know, but one piece that I started programming a lot in the last 5 or 6 years is Rudolph Barchai's arrangement of Shostakovich's 4th string quartet, which is a piece that's not played very much. And he did this wonderful arrangement with winds and brass and percussion. But it's a piece that Shostakovich wrote in 1949, right at the height of Soviet anti-Semitism, and it uses tons of Jewish themes in the music, which was a hugely risky thing to do and kind of a borderline insane thing to do because of what danger it put him in. And I find that so profoundly moving that he felt that strongly about it, that he did that. that I think it's just like one of those things that just something we can all learn from. So programming that in a concert and just mentioning as much as saying that this was a very brave thing for him to do, I think that can be really, I think you can send a message without sending a message, if you know what I mean.
Yes, absolutely. Sometimes the worst thing you can do is actually hit them over the head with it.
Exactly.
You have to let them find meaning because everybody comes to, whether it's a concert or a subject matter or whatever, everyone comes with their own background. Right? And they're going to find the nuances that maybe even you weren't thinking of.
Absolutely.
So we have another musician who would like to join us. Now we're going to ask Julia Brandenburg to join us because she has some questions for you.
All right, hello. Thank you for talking with us today.
Sure.
So my question is kind of a two-part, but the first part would have to do with, of course, COVID, what we're all going through. It's impacted the music world in just a way we could have never imagined. So do you think that orchestras will return to what we think as normal? Or do you think our new normal will be kind of drastically altered in any way?
It depends on where, to be honest. I've got concerts in September in Switzerland because there's no virus there anymore, and it's controlled. And here in the UK, it's sort of half under control. And so the orchestras are thinking maybe we can come back in the fall. We're not sure yet. And in the US, obviously it's a total disaster. And, there's nothing happening. A lot of orchestras are canceling their entire seasons. But I think am I right? You're asking more about after, like post-vaccine, post-treatment, everything. I think it'll depend a little bit on how every orchestra chooses to get through this year. If they're able to hunker down and get through this really tough time, I think they'll come out stronger for it. Because I do think there will be a huge hunger for live performance after the pandemic passes. I think I don't agree with the people who say everybody will just work from home. There won't be group events. I think we're social creatures. We want to be together. So I do think there will be a huge boom actually in concert attendance after. But I do think orchestras should take this opportunity to change. I think orchestras should think about how to get really deeply involved in their communities. I'm actually somebody who's not a huge proponent of orchestras touring all over the world all the time. I think it's not pointless at all, but I think you can get a lot more impact, social impact, by working in a community, especially since a lot of school districts have taken arts education out of their schools. I think sometimes rather than a 2-week tour where you fly 140 musicians 6,000 miles around the world, what if you spent that 2 weeks in 14 different schools and putting on a really fantastic, engaging program for students? So I think in those ways, things can change. Obviously there's going to be like a lot of belt tightening, which is natural. The economic crisis, no matter where. I mean, it's bad everywhere. So that's going to be difficult. But, I do think if people can somehow, this is not easy, get through this year and, the next 12 months, I think there will be a real light at the end of the tunnel.
Right. Right. And do you feel like some of the smaller orchestras, so say not Boston or New York or Dallas, do you think that some of these orchestras will be able to recover? Because it's a big topic that a lot of us who are in the audition circuit right now are a little bit worried about, because maybe some of those smaller orchestras are kind of what we're going for at the moment to kind of get our foot in the door, essentially. And so do you see them recovering as well as, say, an orchestra like New York?
I mean, you're absolutely right that certainly the big five and other American, top American orchestras are in a better position in some ways, but some orchestras have gone through bankruptcy not 5 years ago. So, that's a problem. An orchestra like the Boston Symphony, which has a huge endowment, is in a much better position than another one that is having financial problems before the pandemic hit. Right. So I think it will depend on the leadership of the orchestra. It'll depend on the musicians and the relationship and the trust that's between the administration and the union and how we can navigate this all together. I think as soon as it becomes adversarial, it becomes really dangerous, and it can be it can destroy the organization if that happens. And every CEO, every president of every orchestra is going to have to find a way to get the sponsors, get the donors. I mean, in Europe, again, it's a little easier in some ways because it's government funded. Like my orchestra in Switzerland, we were going to put concerts on for 200 people because the ticket sales are not a huge source of our revenue. Most of our money comes from government subsidy. But, you know, governments in Europe are also cutting budgets. So, you know, who's going to be first? Probably orchestras. So it's, you know, there's no perfect system. And I mean, to be honest, sorry, I'm going around and around your question a little bit. I do think some orchestras will probably not survive, bluntly. But there's no way to know which ones. And obviously my deepest hope is that every single one can.
Right. Right. Well, thank you so much for answering our questions. Yeah, we really appreciate it.
Thank you.
That was great, Josh. I appreciate that answer. I really enjoyed hearing your thoughts on that. So we're going to ask you now I've asked Josh to, you know, just sort of talk to the musicians a little bit and have a conversation with them on his thoughts on, you know, sort of a nice segue from Julia's question to begin with, because it's got a lot to do with the music business and future music and musicians and professionalism and all that. So if you wouldn't mind, why don't you let us in on your thoughts?
Sure. So yeah, Dave asked me to come up with a little bit of a longer topic to discuss. And that's something I've been thinking about a lot during the pandemic, but honestly before as well, is about the importance of openness and flexibility in this orchestral landscape. And it goes back to Julia's question as well about how orchestras might have to change after the pandemic. And I'm just going to ask a few questions to all of you, and just to think about. What percentage of music do you think you performed in the last year that was by a living composer? What percentage of music do you think you performed in the last year that was by a female composer or by a composer of color? These are questions I've asked myself a lot over the past 4 or 5 years. And, you know, classical music tends to be a somewhat conservative institution, not politically, but more in terms of how it functions, with a lot of traditions that are, in some cases, 120 years old. And I think post the pandemic, and also, you know, even if there hadn't ever been this pandemic, I think there's something really to be said for a kind of openness to new things that classical musicians could do better at. And I include myself in that as well. And what I'm talking about is not destroying any canon or getting rid of things, but actually just to sort of modernize and expand a little bit. And also to try to examine our own knee-jerk skepticism that we often have to something new. And an example that I can give to that is Florence Price, who is a wonderful composer. In case you're not familiar with her, she was alive in the first half of the 20th century. She was the first African-American woman to have a piece performed by a major orchestra. The Chicago Symphony played her first symphony in 1933. And it was a huge success, got great reviews, and then just fell off the map. And over the last 10 or 15 years, her music has, quote unquote, been rediscovered. And so orchestras are programming it a little bit more now, but I've done 2 of her symphonies and her piano concerto in 4 or 5 different countries. And the reaction that I constantly get is, oh, this just sounds like Dvorak. And it does a little bit, but actually it's a little bit of a silly comparison, because what Florence Price was writing in her idiom of writing was what Dvorak took from her culture 30 years before that. And Dvorak famously said that Black American music should be the basis of a new school of American classical composition. And unfortunately, his advice wasn't really taken up, but Florence Price did, because she was just writing in her own idiom. And so what I sort of argue for is not to say that the Dvorak New World Symphony should not be played and be replaced by a Florence Price symphony, but actually that Florence Price can sit alongside him as another wonderful composer and someone who really, shows us the tapestry of the American music. And the other thing that kind of goes along with that is if you think about the Dvorak New World Symphony, which was premiered, I believe, 130 years ago, it's had now, 10,000 performances. It's been recorded by every conductor, every orchestra. And there's been a performance tradition that's built up with this piece that is really wonderful. And a piece like Florence Price's, or a piece like the William Levi Dawson Negro Folk Symphony, or another set of composers who I've become really attached to is a group of composers whose music was suppressed by the Nazis in the 30s. And these composers also have been somewhat forgotten. And I think it's really important that we bring these composers back and also be excited to build that tradition for those composers. That's something that we can do now. And this isn't about tokenism or anything. It's not about doing things we don't believe in. I think you have to perform the things that you strongly believe in. For example, I love the music of Florence Price. I don't so much love the music of William Grant Still. There are other people that do, and so I think that's how we bring these traditions to life. It's the same that I don't love Wagner, but my brother-in-law, Raphael, adores Wagner. So, we have that kind of trade-off. And just as a last thing in this little, this expansion of this topic, I think there's a practical matter of it as well about being open, and now I'm talking more about new music. Two examples that I can think of are Caroline Shaw and Jörg Wiedmann, who both write music with a lot of extended techniques. And I think, again, our knee-jerk reaction often is, oh, I don't know, this is different. I don't get this. I don't get how to do that. And actually, if you think back to 250 years ago, Beethoven's symphonies were famously, quote, unplayable. No one could get a handle on them. The orchestra that Tchaikovsky premiered his Sixth Symphony with famously tied white flags to their bows because they said it could not be played. It was impossible. The Rite of Spring, there's actually the first recording of the Rite of Spring in 1929 with Pierre Monteux. I mean, you can tell the orchestra is like riding something that's about to go careening off the rails. They can barely get a handle on it. And yet they continued to play this music and they got better at it. And I think we have the same situation now. With Jörg Wiedmann, he wrote a wonderful piece called The Hunter String Quartet, where the two violins and the viola at one point are supposed to attack the cellist. And the cellist is supposed to give an existential scream of terror. And that's not something that's natural to a lot of classical musicians. But I think this goes back a little bit to education. And we need to learn, along with our Beethoven, along with our Brahms, along with our Schubert, Schumann, all the great composers of the canon, we have to be emphasizing new music so that we are open to it. Which means, in the end, that we don't know which composers in 250 years are going to be the Beethovens of our time. We can guess, but we just don't know. And I think often, because of our obsession with the past, we look at every piece like a scouting mission. Like, is this the piece? Is this the piece that's going to survive? We just don't know. There's a wonderful book that I reference a lot called The Lexicon of Musical Invective, which features reviews, terrible reviews of pieces that are now beloved. And we have the same situation now. And so what I'm basically advocating for is to be open, to be flexible, and to be thinking about, am I going to be the performer that's referenced in 250 years who premiered this piece and advocated for it, and in the case of the composers of the past, brought it back to life, and in the case of the composers from now, be that first person that premiered the piece. And I think we can be the advocates for the future in that way.
Oh, that's fantastic. You know what I love about hearing you speak about this is the passion, because it's not just the programming of it, right? You have to be passionate to give the best performance. Mm-hmm. I remember when I was first starting out, I left school, got my first orchestra job, left that job, went to another, a little bigger orchestra, started playing with that orchestra. And it was David Zinman who, after having already a fairly decent career, but David taught me how to love new music and American music and embrace the new and the unknown, and to find the most important things about it, as you would for Beethoven or Bach or anyone else. You know,
Absolutely.
you have to do your due diligence. You have to work. You have to be in there, in the score, to really do it the justice that it deserves, like any other composer.
Yeah, I think sometimes as musicians we can get into, and I include myself in this, we can get into what I call new music syndrome, where the goal is to just get through the piece and get all the notes in somewhat the right place. But actually that's not doing a service to the composer. And we are the ones who are going to build that tradition, that performance tradition. And I think being an advocate for new music means really digging in and doing the exact same, approaching it, as you said, approaching it the exact same way that you would approach a Beethoven symphony.
Absolutely. That's fantastic. Thank you. Thank you
Sure.
for all of that. So a couple of questions here just in general. Can you, if you have any advice for our musicians as they prepare to enter their classical music profession, what kinds of things would you like to instill in their thinking?
Well, I mean, openness and flexibility for sure. Kind of versatility, I think. Again, going back to what Julia asked about with, what will the future be like after the pandemic? I think, we all have to get good at doing a lot of different things. I don't know. I mean, it's certainly possible. I mean, living here, I've been amazed at how quickly things have somewhat gone back to normal post the pandemic. But with that said, I think, learning other styles of music is certainly something that will enrich your playing of classical music and also maybe help in a career. Learning a lot of technology about how to perform online. I did this project with the Bartok violin duos where I played with 44 different violinists, and the different tech setups were quite striking from different people, and mine was probably the worst. And getting a recording from someone who had set up all of this equipment and had, of course, the money to do that was a different experience. So yeah, I think that kind of versatility and real just kind of if you really love doing this and you love music, then you'll find your place in it, I think. And that may or may not be the plan that you had when you graduated, but I think you will end up finding your place.
Yeah, that no truer words have been spoken. You think about where we are now and what we were thinking when we were beginning our careers. No one would predicted this conversation or anything close to it. And it's being ready to walk through the door.
Absolutely.
The great thing I love about this time now, and COVID is certainly very difficult for our musicians, but in general, this period of time, when I was in school, you were going to be an orchestral player if you're, wind, brass, percussion, bass player. Strings had a couple more options, pianists, maybe a soloist or chamber musician, but there wasn't a lot of other options out there. Crazy instrumental groups that, can form and doing covers and pop tunes and classical and mashups and their own pieces and, really great contemporary composers, and then putting it out on YouTube and touring and all of these things. Those options are now available to us, and like for orchestras that have to find a new opportunity post-COVID. And certainly while COVID is a horrible thing that's going on in this country and around the world, we have to find opportunity in it. And I think orchestras, the orchestras who survive will have done that.
Yeah.
And so do our musicians, right? We all have to sort of find that way through what it is. And that passion that drives us is the thing that's going to help us be the compass.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Totally agree.
Yeah. So I will remind everyone that if you'd like to ask any questions of Josh, please use your Q&A button and write in anything. We have one question from somebody who asked simply, how old are you?
I'm 32.
32. Okay. But it's a very old 32. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. I feel it every morning.
So, you've got your podcast, you had the Bartok project, which was a very, very cool, inspired thing. What kind of things are you doing now? Because you don't have an orchestra to practice during COVID.
So I'm doing a Beethoven Cycle in September for the birthday. We were really worried because we actually scheduled it after most other people's Beethoven cycles, but now we're the only ones who get to do one because of the pandemic. So I saw a really funny joke, I think it was on Twitter, that somebody said it's such a Beethoven thing to have a subito piano after, all this build up, and then subito piano for Beethoven's 250th birthday. It's a very nerdy, geeky joke, but I thought it was funny. I'm studying a lot for that, because obviously putting together 9 symphonies in a couple of months is a big job, even though I've done most of them. And also I've actually been having the time to watch a lot of conducting masterclasses with people like Gergiev. There's one that I recommend to every single person in the world, which is a class that just came up with Ivan Fischer and the Concerto Orchestra in Amsterdam. It's over 4 parts. Each part is about 3 hours. It's some of the most extraordinary teaching that I've ever seen about conducting, and you really learn a lot about conducting watching it. And the sort of level of inspiration and almost childlike enthusiasm he has for music is just super inspiring. So it's been great. I've been kind of able to think of myself as a student again, because I don't have to go into the professional world and conduct for the last 3 or 4 months. So I've been able to do a lot of studying and reading, again, kind of digging into more composer biographies, reading one about Chopin right now. That's been the silver lining of what has obviously been a very difficult time.
Great. Well, sorry to jump around a little bit, but we have a question that's back to auditions. And generally, it's the basic topic of auditions, but I thought I would come back to a couple of questions that we didn't ask before, if that's okay with you. Oh, wait, it just came in. Hang on. Okay, this is a good question. You actually brought it up a little earlier. A violin audition is advertised. A bunch of people come, and no one is hired. Oftentimes this is sort of the one orchestra. But there are certainly orchestras who are better known for that than others. How can an orchestra justify the expense, the work, the process of all the things that every musician has to go through to get to an audition and to do it just to not take someone?
Yeah, it's tough. And it's not good, for sure. And I mean, I'm certainly aware of how much work that has been put into these kind of things. I think in the case where my orchestra didn't take someone, so my orchestra is set up a little bit differently. Our first round is done with me and the principal players of the instrument family. So if it's a violin audition, we have the string principals and me. If it's the winds, we have the wind principals and me, and so on. And that is expanded for this second, and we have only 3 rounds, to the entire orchestra voting, which is 42 people plus myself. And I have a veto right. And so in the case where we didn't take someone, I think the vote ended up being 18 against 17 for. And I had to make the decision, do we take this person or not? And I thought, actually, in a position like that, you really want to have a pretty strong majority of people. And so I said, in the end, let's not. Let's just do it again. And the truth is, we ended up finding someone who was unanimously chosen the next time. I think one thing that does bother me too is when orchestras do it a lot. I think sometimes, a lot of people come and it just doesn't work out. Somebody doesn't play well. I remember an audition in Lausanne also where a violinist I knew quite well, who was an amazing player, came, and he or she just didn't play very well. And so they got eliminated. And that happens sometimes. But I do think with orchestras that have it happen over and over again, or where they hold a position, somebody who has the position but isn't given tenure for years at a time, that I'm not a fan of.
Well, and it can happen in competitions as well. The thing that bugs me horribly is 2 second prize winners and no first prize. Yeah. Right? I mean, come on, that's terrible.
Sometimes you're just hedging your bets, and that I don't like that either. But it's I totally feel for people who show up to an audition and play, and then in the end, no one is chosen. It can be incredibly frustrating.
Yeah. So last opportunity for anyone who would like to share a question with us. I'll briefly say that there will be a survey after this conversation for please let us know how we're doing. Fill out the survey. It really helps us for future engagements. We really greatly appreciate it. So Josh, just a couple of last questions that I really, sure. You've been such a great sport, and we've been on for a while. It's a lot. It's a lot, and I really appreciate you taking the time.
Hey, I'm a conductor. I like to talk. It's that kind of thing.
I really don't understand why conductors, they've got arms. Why do they have to use their mouth?
My teacher, Hugh Wolf, his favorite thing to tell us in class was, okay, in 3 words or less, solve this problem, and that was a good way of putting it, I think.
That's great. I remember, I did the festival, the Charles Montour Domain School in Maine.
Yeah.
One summer, and Charles Bruch was the instructor then. He was a bastard. He was a violent guy, right? But he once got up in front of the orchestra just to prove a point. We were doing the prayer at Appalachian Spring, very end of it. He put his hands in his pocket, said no words, and just started to breathe.
Yeah.
The orchestra started to play, and it was absolutely magnificent. It was really one of the great moments, eye-opening moments of what is possible. What
Absolutely.
Carl is asking the Brahms biographer that you were recommending.
Jan Swafford. Maybe I'll type the name. He is an amazing writer. He wrote a great book about Beethoven as well, and Ives, and I think he's just writing a book about Mozart now. So the Brahms book. I come back to it regularly, and I was going to bring it with me for the Brahms one. We were going to do it in Breckenridge, but obviously can't do it.
Yeah, that's we'd be doing that tomorrow night, I think.
I know.
Our concert would be tomorrow night.
I know.
Yeah, it's really tough. I'm very sorry you're not here.
Me too.
This is great. As a young conductor going into a rehearsal with a major orchestra, how do you balance speaking and letting the orchestras sort out their problems for themselves? How do you balance technical instruction and musical instruction? And that brings, I was going to ask the same question in a very different way, but I use that word, relaxed command of the orchestra, which I think you absolutely have. But it gets to Jerry's question of, what is instinctual? What have you thought through ahead of time? Take us through that.
It's a difficult position to be in, because I think of it, you're in the role of the conductor. It doesn't matter if you're 16 or 97, you're in the role of being the conductor. So you do have a job to do. But as you said, a major orchestra knows a lot of these pieces really well. They've played them with some of the great artists of their time. And so you don't want to, in a way, meddle too much. But what you can do is, I think, steer the ship in a way, with your vision of a piece. An example that I can give is with the New York Philharmonic. I jumped in on a concert of all Ravel a couple of years ago, and we it was some classics and some pieces that were less familiar of Ravel's. And what the concert ended with Bolero, of course. And at first, my strategy was to do very little and let Chris Lamb, the wonderful principal of percussion of the New York Phil, sort of lead the way. And I realized that we ran it through once, which is essentially how long you get to rehearse Bolero, because if you do any more than that, it can be extremely dangerous to your physical health, and more mental health, but yeah. And I realized, though, it wasn't working very well. There was maybe there wasn't a connection between what some soloists were doing in the percussion. And so I actually started getting more involved. And I talked with some of the wind players after the rehearsal, and they said, yeah, we actually really want you to sort of guide us through it, because it's hard for us to hear, and everybody thinks of it slightly differently. And so a piece that I thought I could do the least in, I ended up doing the most in the whole concert, actually. So sometimes your expectations are very different from what happens. One time where the expectation was correct in a way, I jumped in also with the Philadelphia Orchestra doing Brahms' Third Symphony, and Philadelphia is famous for their Brahms. And so I came in knowing some things that I think I could influence and show a little bit of a different way, maybe. And we worked on them, and the orchestra was so open to that, I think partly because I didn't want to collapse things and try to build it up from the ground up, which would have been useless anyway, even if I had wanted to do that. But to sort of pick and choose things that I thought were important and bring how I felt about the music, because they do want to know what you want. Orchestras, I think they do kind of not like it when a conductor comes and says, oh, it just sounds great, go home. Maybe a certain portion of that, but in general, the orchestra wants to know how you feel about the music, or else why are you conducting? So it's a tough balance to walk. I think, if I can put it in a very short way, sorry to be going on, is to be yourself and have strong ideas, but to come with the greatest respect for the musicians as well.
That's great. I really appreciate that. Just sort of to finish up a little bit. Have you been to Breckenridge before? Have you ever been to our little town?
I have been to Breckenridge once. I conducted at the Breckenridge Music Festival with a very fun program with Beethoven's Fourth Symphony and a piece by David Bruce, which was a really great time. I spent a lot of time in Colorado, though, because my parents taught at Aspen for many years when I was a kid. So I spent many years basically growing up every summer in Aspen. And then when I was working at the New York Phil, I was in Vail a lot. So I know the general area quite well.
Right. And do you find any issues, or have you ever had issues with the altitude?
Yeah. So I conducted at Aspen 3 or 4 years ago, and I was doing Shostakovich 5. And there's that long section in the first movement that gets slowly faster and faster and faster and more crazed in a way. And we got to the climax of that, and I had to stop because I was so completely out of breath in the first rehearsal. And I was, just trying to suck in as much air as possible. And so I learned how to, physically kind of manage that. And I think I was also in really terrible shape when I came that summer. So now I'm hopefully in better shape for the next time I come to Breckenridge.
That's great. That's great. And so now I have one last question for you.
Sure.
Which is, let's just go with the one last question because you've been here for a while now. And which is, what do you love about music?
So I think, let me think about this for a second. I don't think music can change the world in the way that I think it's the cliched way that it's often said. I do think that music can make the world seem a little better for a few minutes at a time. And it can do that in a way that I personally don't feel any other art can. I'm sure other people might feel differently, but I feel that way. That when I listen to, I'm running a podcast about Mahler's 6 right now. And when I listen to that last movement, which just covers the entire human experience and then gets destroyed at the end, I think about what we're going through right now and a possibility, because I think the thing that's so devastating about that symphony is everything's at stake until 2 minutes before the end. And then it goes the complete opposite way from every other symphony in the book, practically. But then I think about another piece that I was listening to a lot when the pandemic started, which was Shostakovich 7, a piece that was written under the most arduous circumstances you can possibly imagine, a famine, a siege that killed 1 million people in the most gruesome circumstances possible. And Shostakovich wrote a piece that is just full of defiance and hope and power. And they played a performance of that. The musicians who were starving to death, musicians died during the rehearsals. And they broadcast the performance over loudspeakers to the Soviet soldiers on the front line. And the story goes, I don't know if it's true, but that the German soldiers also could hear it from across the, whatever, I don't know war terminology, from across the front lines. And they said when they heard that music, they knew they had lost the war and they knew they were never going to take Russia because the music had such a power to them. Now that's a very specific example, but I think that music can just show us every possible emotion in such a profoundly direct way, in a way that all the words that I'm saying right now cannot do. 1 second of music means more than that. So yeah, I mean, that's the thing I love about music, is its ability to communicate.
That's great. That's wonderful. Look, I can't thank you enough for taking your time out.
Of course.
For braving the time zone difference.
That's okay. Just in time for dinner. It's perfect.
Good. And look, this has been really fantastic. So thank you so much. We really greatly appreciate it. Good luck. I'll be looking forward to hearing about Swiss Beethoven performances coming up very soon. Lausanne is a gorgeous town. It's a beautiful place.
It really is. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for having me, and good luck to everybody. I know it's been a really tough time, and it's great that Dave and NRO could put this together for everyone. And I've seen all the ads for the other seminars, which is just fantastic. So it's a substitute in some ways, but it's a really nice consolation.
Well, thank you very much. And for those who are still on, please make sure you fill out your survey at the end. And Joshua Weilerstein, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye, everyone.